Right now, the United States and Iran are at war. Missiles are flying. Cities are burning. The world is holding its breath. But here's what most people watching the news don't know. This didn't start last week. It didn't start with a nuclear deal, or a drone strike, or a speech at the United Nations. It started in 1953, with a single decision made in secret. A decision that toppled a democracy, installed a dictator, and set off a chain reaction that is still exploding today. This is the full story. And once you know it, you can't unknow it. To understand why Iran hates America, you have to go back to oil. In 1908, a British prospector struck oil in southwestern Iran. It was one of the largest deposits ever found. The British government moved fast. They created the Anglo-Persian Oil Company and secured the rights to extract Iranian oil for almost nothing. Iran received a fraction of the profits. Britain kept the rest. For decades, Iranians watched their most valuable resource flow out of their country and into the coffers of a foreign empire. Then, in 1951, something extraordinary happened. A 69-year-old lawyer named Mohammad Mossadegh was elected Prime Minister of Iran. Mossadegh was unlike any leader Iran had seen. He was emotional, principled, and absolutely fearless. He wept openly in parliament. He held press conferences in his pajamas from his bed, and he had one mission: to give Iran's oil back to the Iranian people. In April 1951, the Iranian parliament voted unanimously to nationalize the oil industry. The British were furious. They imposed a global embargo on Iranian oil, blockaded Iranian ports, and froze Iranian assets abroad. They wanted Mossadegh destroyed. But the Iranian people loved him. To them, he was the first leader in modern history who had actually stood up to a foreign power and said, "This land is ours, this oil is ours, and we are not your colony." Britain tried everything to remove him through legal and political channels. It all failed. So they turned to the Americans. The British pitch to Washington was simple. Mossadegh, they said, was a communist. If he stayed in power, Iran would fall to the Soviet Union. The Cold War would be lost in the Middle East. It was largely a lie. Mossadegh was an Iranian nationalist, not a communist. He was actually deeply suspicious of the Soviet Union. But it worked. President Eisenhower approved the plan. The CIA called it Operation Ajax. The British called it Operation Boot. Together, they were about to overthrow the democratically elected government of a sovereign nation for the first time in American history. The man chosen to run the operation was Kermit Roosevelt, Jr., grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt. He slipped into Tehran in secret and began buying everyone he could. Newspaper editors, military officers, religious leaders, street gangs. The CIA paid thugs to attack mosques while posing as Mossadegh supporters, making it look like the Prime Minister's followers were anti-religious. They planted fake news stories. They bribed politicians to turn against him. The first coup attempt failed. Mossadegh found out, and the Shah panicked. He fled Iran entirely, flying first to Baghdad and then to Rome. It looked like it was over. But Roosevelt didn't give up. He doubled down, flooding the streets with more paid protesters, more fake news, more chaos. 3 days later, on August 19, 1953, a mob, many of them paid with CIA money, stormed Mossadegh's home. He was arrested, tried for treason, sentenced to 3 years in prison, then placed under house arrest for the rest of his life. The Shah returned from Rome on an American military plane. Iran's democracy was over. A CIA historian would later write that the operation transformed a constitutional monarchy into an absolutist dictatorship and set off a chain of unintended consequences that would haunt the world for generations. With the Shah back in power, America got everything it wanted. Iranian oil flowed to Western companies. The Shah signed military agreements with Washington. Iran became America's most important ally in the Middle East. But for ordinary Iranians, the next 26 years were a nightmare. The Shah, backed by American money and American training, built one of the most feared secret police forces in the world. He called it Savak. Savak arrested dissidents, tortured political prisoners, and crushed any opposition to the Shah's rule. Thousands of Iranians were imprisoned, tortured, or disappeared. While the Shah built gleaming palaces and hosted lavish parties for Western dignitaries, millions of Iranians lived in poverty. The anger built slowly, then all at once. By the late 1970s, the streets of Tehran were filled with protesters. Workers, students, clerics, all of them united by one thing: hatred of the Shah and the American government that kept him in power. In January 1979, the Shah fled Iran for the last time. The revolution had won. What came next shocked the world. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a radical cleric who had been exiled for years, returned to Iran to thunderous crowds. Millions of people flooded the streets to welcome him. Iran declared itself an Islamic republic. The constitution was rewritten around religious law, and Khomeini made one thing absolutely clear: America was the enemy. He called it the Great Satan. Then came November 4th, 1979. A group of Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 52 American diplomats hostage. They held them for 444 days. Why the embassy? Because in 1953, CIA officers had used the U.S. Embassy as their base of operations to plan the coup against Mossadegh. The students were determined that would never happen again. The hostage crisis destroyed the presidency of Jimmy Carter. It cemented Iran's image in American minds as a rogue, fanatical state, and the wound between the two countries went from deep to permanent. In 1980, Iraq's Saddam Hussein invaded Iran. The war that followed lasted 8 years and killed over 1 million people. And here is where the story gets darker still. The United States quietly backed Saddam Hussein. Washington supplied Iraq with satellite intelligence on Iranian troop positions. American companies sold Saddam chemical weapon precursors that he used to gas Iranian soldiers and Kurdish civilians. Iran fought alone, bleeding, sanctioned, isolated from the world. When the war finally ended in 1988 with no clear winner, Iran had lost an entire generation of young men and had nothing to show for it except a burning conviction that America could never be trusted. Through the 1990s and 2000s, Iran began developing its nuclear program. Iran said it was for energy. The United States and Israel said it was for weapons. In 2002, President George W. Bush named Iran part of an axis of evil alongside Iraq and North Korea. The message was clear. Regime change was on the table. Iran watched as the U.S. invaded Iraq next door and toppled Saddam Hussein in 3 weeks. The lesson Iran drew was simple. Countries without nuclear weapons get invaded. Countries with nuclear weapons do not. In 2015, after years of negotiations, Iran signed the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal. Iran agreed to limit its nuclear program. Sanctions were lifted. For a brief moment, It seemed like the two countries might finally step back from the edge. Then in 2018, President Trump pulled the United States out of the deal. Sanctions were reimposed. Iran's economy collapsed, and the hardliners in Tehran, who had always said America couldn't be trusted, were proved right again. In January 2020, a U.S. drone strike near Baghdad airport killed General Qasem Soleimani, the most powerful military commander in Iran and one of the most beloved figures in the country. Iran fired ballistic missiles at U.S. bases in Iraq in retaliation. For one night, the world held its breath waiting for full-scale war. It didn't come then, but the pressure never stopped building. Proxy conflicts in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. Iranian drones supplied to Russia. U.S. strikes on Iranian-backed militias. Israeli operations against Iranian nuclear facilities. Each action, each retaliation, each escalation, pulling the two countries closer and closer to the confrontation that is now unfolding. Everything you are watching on the news right now traces back to a single moment. August 19, 1953. A CIA officer in Tehran with a briefcase full of cash and a mission to destroy a democracy. Mohammad Mossadegh spent the rest of his life under house arrest. He died in 1967, never pardoned, never rehabilitated in his own country. Iran never forgot what happened. America never fully admitted it. That gap between what one country remembers and what another country refuses to acknowledge is where wars are born. And that gap is still open today.